sulfur and a stench like burning, a wailing and a gnashing of teeth. You would be forgiven for thinking that Jesus was describing the slums of Mumbai or Lagos. You would be forgiven because many of these slums are like a hell on earth. Unsustainable rural-urban migration in developing nations presents perhaps the greatest threat to the hope for a better, safer life for the people of these countries. We believe as proposition that it's the government's duty to mitigate these dangers for their people. As such, I'll be dealing with three issues of substantive matter as first speaker. First, I'll be dealing with the government mandate, proving that the government has a duty to enact our model. Secondly, the harms of uncontrolled migration to urban areas in particular. And thirdly, the irrationality of the decision to move to urban areas in the first place, while be proving that it's a legitimate limitation for the government to enact. My second speaker, Bryn, will be dealing with the harms to rural areas and how our model improves them. But first, our definition. And we would define rural-urban migration as the process by which people move to urban areas from rural areas. In this debate, within the borders of an individual developing country. Our model, then, is that the government will be able to limit or control two things. Firstly, the numbers of people migrating, but secondly, where they go, to which cities they are migrating. This is based on the premise that some cities are still livable, or more so than others, and the government can direct people appropriately. They have that prerogative. What we believe as proposition is that the government is obliged to intervene when an action causes A, harms to individuals in society, but more than that, harms to the society itself. And those are the two criteria with which will justify the government's action. So first, some context. And we think that there are primarily two areas where this debate takes place, urban areas and rural areas. However, we'd argue that the problems in overpopulated urban areas are horrifically bad, to the point of being unlivable. We're seeing massive slums being created in many large cities, where millions of people live in tiny shacks with no sanitation, no electricity, no water, and no space. 90% of the urban population of Malawi, Uganda, and Ethiopia already live in slums. And by 2030, the UN projects that over 2 billion people worldwide will also live in slums. Rural areas, on the other hand, also have some problems. They often have poor infrastructure, like tar roads and things like that. However, life there is still bearable, it's still livable. People have land which provides sustenance, and there are less of the problems associated with population density, disease, crime, things like that, as I'll speak about later. Moreover, the nature of a developing country is that it has resource constraints. They can't improve cities in the status quo, they can't handle unsustainable population growth, which means that things are getting rapidly worse for people. So firstly, on to the issue of the government mandate. No, thank you. And I'll be proving that our model allows the government to fulfill its role in society. We think that the government has unique information and knowledge which allows them to analyze situations or trends and see the bigger picture in a country. They can plan food and water provision, infrastructure development, and service delivery. We think they must use this knowledge to limit harms and to do what's in the best interests of their people. The government's role, we would argue, is to stop their people from making decidedly bad choices, but not to force them to take good ones. And so under our model, we still give people some autonomy in their own lives. Why is this relevant? And I'll take you in a moment. Why is this relevant in today's debate? And we have to look at the infrastructural harms to cities with an increased influx of migrants. But first, I'll take your POI.
Would you rather take away the autonomy of the people or have that all infringe on their rights to movement?
Well, if limiting their rights to movement means that we ensure other rights, that we ensure they have a better life, better quality of life, we think that's legitimate. We think the government must do that. So in terms of the infrastructural burden on cities, we see that cities in the status quo cannot handle large-scale migration. Their infrastructure simply cannot develop fast enough. We see this in real terms where, for example, we see 150,000 bus accident deaths in Mumbai every year. Mumbai being the most densely populated city in the world. Why is this? Because their transport system simply cannot bear the burden of the millions of Indians who move to the city. It's also difficult for cities, no thank you, to maintain existing infrastructure because it's overused, because the money for maintenance is stretched thin. We think that the government can use their unique knowledge and planning ability to control the numbers of people coming to cities and controlling which cities they go to. This allows them to mitigate these harms and to maximize the quality of life for the people in their country. No, thank you. What other harms then do cities face. And this is my second point of substantive. Well, I'll be proving that there are also economic and associated social harms with an increased influx of migrants to cities. So firstly, in terms of the economic harms of rural-urban migration, we see that migrants who arrive in cities saturate the job market to a point where labour supply exceeds demand. We see that unemployment in cities soars as a result, and what essentially happens is that people come to cities to find work, but most never find a job. And those that do find a job are forced to work in poor conditions for low wages, because there's always somebody else who doesn't have a job who could take your place. It leads to a race to the bottom in these cities, which leads to severe problems for the inhabitants. There's no job security for those with jobs. Those who earn wages, their wages are so low that they don't have spending power. But at the most basic level, most people never get a job in the first place, and so we don't think it's legitimate to allow them to come in the first scenario. No, thank you. Then in terms of the social harms associated with this migration, and the first thing we need to look at is in terms of crime. We see that with an increased influx of people to urban areas, we get more people without jobs, more people end up in slums. These people must turn to petty crime, even organized crime, in order to sustain themselves, and this initiates a violent cycle of increased crime in these countries. Slums become hotbeds for gangs and narcotics rings, and police are unable to deal with increased crime because they're stretched thin. The second thing we see is in terms of disease, where densely populated areas with poor sanitation lead to an easy spread of diseases like tuberculosis, like the HIV epidemic in South African townships. Lastly, in terms of the environment, more people in cities equals to more pollution. It's difficult to maintain a clean environment, particularly because of the informal nature of these settlements, where people are living on top of each other and where it's very difficult to regulate this type of thing. So we see that there are serious harms to cities in the status quo, and serious harms to the individuals migrating. Not only to newly arrived migrants who don't get what they want, no thank you, but also to the people living in cities in the first place, the existing inhabitants, who are also detrimented unfairly by this increased migration. It's not fair to any of these entities. So lastly, in terms of the irrationality of the decision, we think that the migrants' choice is illegitimate and irrational because they're acting on false or limited information. You're out of order. Despite all of the harms I've just listed, people still go to cities. Why do we think they do that? Because of the perception that life is better. What they don't see are the shadows behind the bright lights. They don't realize that their logic is a pseudo-logic, that they aren't going to get jobs when they arrive in cities. To the extent that people will flock to the nearest large city as opposed to more viable smaller ones. And this just goes to prove the severe irrationality of people's decision. Where, for example, in China, millions of Chinese people flock directly to Beijing because it seemed to be the largest and most viable city, and bypass smaller provincial cities which could accommodate them better. That's simply because of the perception, a false perception, and a pseudo-logic. So in conclusion, in terms of our framework, we see significant harms to individuals with rural-urban migration, as well as significant harms to society. They have to show us why the government doesn't need to act to protect their society. Ladies and gentlemen, Jesus came to earth to stop people from going to hell after death. We think that governments must protect their people from hell in life. Thank you.
Now, the fact of the matter is, all these people know, for one thing, for it's only rational and logical for them to go out and get what's rightfully theirs, because government is failing, to take it there to the rural villages, where there is that fertile land, where there, please sit down, right? Where there is opportunity for development, so that is actually nullified. And then the harms of uncontrolled migration. Now, the interesting thing about this point is it's a surface point. This is to say, these are symptoms of a much greater underlying problem. And it's not necessarily being solved by limiting the number of people going from rural areas to urban areas. Because there is a difference, as we mentioned, in the number of jobs, the sanitary services, as we mentioned, and other things. Now, the background to this motion, why do people migrate in the first place? We've classified two areas, rural and urban. Rural areas can be categorized by a lack of services. And people look for these services, and because of this, they end up moving to urbanized areas. This can also be seen internationally by people moving from poor countries to developed countries. Even though it's a perilous journey, fraught with much danger, they know for a fact that because of their aspirations, they must try everything in their power to get that. Now, why is the move the best thing to do, even though it seems so bleak? Just hold on for 1 minute. Why do they do this, even though it seems so bleak? The fact of the matter is, when they get to these urban areas, they will get noticed, and jobs at least are within reach. Not everyone's going to get a job, that is a fact, and we concede to that fact. Not everyone does get a job, not everyone will get job security. But the fact is, jobs are at least within reach.
Thousands of people flock to the city of Mumbai every day from rural areas, but only a fifth get a job. This is a problem because they end up going to live in slums and have even worse and more adverse conditions on their lives. We think that's dangerous.
That is true. That is dangerous, ladies and gentlemen. But what can we do to get them moving back? We, as side opposition, believe that it is time for government to reacquaint itself with its development allocation program. Go back and see where you're missing the problem. The fact of the matter is there's an uneven distribution of development within the countries themselves. And this is causing the tens of thousands of people that Madam Speaker has mentioned to move every day. And sadly, only a fifth will ever see their dreams coming true, but that isn't stopping anyone. Countries which have been observed not to have these problems of rural to urban migration because of the fact that they pay so much attention to the development engagement program is, for example, your UAE, United Arab Emirates, and also Switzerland. Those are countries that have really worked hard to ensure that there is as equal as possible development within a country. Now, our position as side opposition is simple. People should not be prevented from moving. This is because there is an unequitable distribution of resources in the country. So rather, make it equal now. Governments, our arguments are thus. Firstly, scarcity of resources. As I've mentioned in my rebuttals, there aren't as many services to cater for people in the village. So essentially, what do they do as citizens of that country? They go out and they find what is rightfully theirs. They move from rural areas to urban areas. So what should you do as side government? Rather than trying to chuck them out of the cities, go to the rural areas, educate them, help them develop their land so that they can do something for themselves and go back, as opposed to chucking them back. Because if you put up barriers, they will find a way to go through at the end of the day. Hold on. Now, the second point is slanted or biased economic policies. Now, under the current atmosphere of the status quo, urban areas are sure to stay urban and rural areas sadly will continue being that way. That is not something that we want to continue to see. Development should be consistent or equal across the board. That is something that the government promises to do. There is a mandate, actually, of government to the people to ensure that all of them are as equally catered for as possible. This form of being patient. Now, why is it bad when one area of a country develops more than others? As you see, people will move. People will try and get what they so rightfully deserve. A very rational action to a very real problem.
So in order for that argument to work, you need to prove to us that your idea of equal development is mutually exclusive to our idea of limits. You need to do that.
Essentially, what we as opposition are to prove is that what you're simply doing is what's called a pyrrhic victory. We may be trying to fix the problem at the end of the day, but the cost that you're incurring to get there, the route you're taking is simply longer than what we suggest, which is that you should fix the problem. Go back to your resource allocation program, because that is essentially where you're going wrong. Someone is not doing their job, so go back to your books, look at where you're going wrong and work on that. I'm sorry I will not be excessive. Cape Town is very, very developed compared to a number of areas within South Africa. So obviously it will look attractive, the lights, the action, the cars, the possibility of getting a job. All that will work to pull people away from the rural villages, where government has so rightly told us that there is an opportunity. Unfortunately, it's not being utilized because because government is unable to cater for them there. Secondly, the concept of labeling people. We are now, this policy which government is trying to push through is going to sort of be a method of causing division within the country, because essentially you are blocking people from going where they want to go. You're saying that people in the urban areas deserve that security, they deserve that. Everyone within the country deserves that, and you should try beyond reasonable doubt to try and get that to the people. Because at the end of the day, if you do go ahead and try and limit the numbers of people, you're pretty much just going back, you're similarly going back to the apartheid days, where apartheid ensured that white people were as catered for as possible and the blacks were not. That's not something we want to see. That individual within the country is very dangerous and could pull us back. People will go where the resources are. So in conclusion, we are saying instead of limiting internal and multiple integration, rather we approach yourself with your resource allocation programs and ensure long-term stability within your country, or long-term goal. What have we done as side opposition today? I've given you 3 substantive points to support our matter. That is to say, that is to say, 1, scarcity of resources is pushing people. 2, slanted or biased economic policies are working against the government right now. And 3, that you are risking the possibility of labeling people. That having been said, we beg to oppose.
Ladies and gentlemen, the first speaker for the opposition told us that he was going to prove 3 things to us. But I can sum up his arguments in one word: provision. Specifically, provision to the rural areas and how we ensure an equal provision of standard of living to people who are currently incentivized to move. We agree that on some level we need to address the problems faced in rural areas. But we think that under a status quo where the incentives don't currently exist, where governments are currently failing to provide for the people in the rural areas because no one is forcing them to, we need to provide actual incentives for government action, and that's exactly what side proposition does, and that's exactly what I'm going to be telling you in my positive matter today, examining the kind of harms that people in the rural areas are expected to live in and how we address them, improving the rural areas, improving the standard of living. But before I get onto that, I have a couple of issues of rebuttal in terms of defensive rebuttal. So firstly, let's look at this idea of government mandate. What we basically heard from Botswana was that all we're doing is slowing down the rate. We're not actually addressing the problem. We'd say, firstly, even if all we're doing is slowing down the rate, we still think that that's important in order to give governments the capability to plan effectively for their people, to ensure that services are there for the number of people that they know actually exist in that city. There's no longer a wondering about how many people live in every city. More than this, though, we'd say that they simply asserted the fact that if you move to the city, you're going to get a job, you're going to have money. But more importantly, we think that there's a very big difference between having money and a job and having some kind of standard of living. We think a lot of people in urban areas are living on standards that we deem unacceptable if you're a human being. We think that in many rural areas, even if all they're doing is bartering with one another, that's the kind of standard of living where they have access to something that doesn't kill them, that is actually important for people to lead some kind of dignified life. More than this, though, we say we're not necessarily trapping people in any kind of situation. Because if you look at the model that we gave you, if they want to move, if the city, whichever they want to move to, doesn't have a level that is unacceptable, we still allow them to do that. We think that's acceptable. Secondly, in terms of choice, we need to look at the fact that we can limit choice in 3 situations. When it's harmful to the individual, when it's harmful to society, and when this choice is irrational. We'd say that living in slums is harmful to the individual. We say that the instability caused by things like crime is harmful to society, and more than this, the fact that people are acting on information that isn't true means that the decisions they're making are irrational. More than this, we simply say that government limits choice all the time. We think it's legitimate for them to do it here, where they're actually protecting the well-being of people within their societies. But now let's look at my positive matter. And what we've heard from Saul already is about the problems caused in urban areas. But what specifically I'm going to be looking at is the rural areas, what problems they face, or other fringe towns we're moving people to, and how we're able to address these harms. We think that there are two types of harms people are currently living under. A, practical harms in terms of service delivery, and B, social or community harms. We think that these harms are enough to hurt the people, to hurt government stability, for us to necessitate government action. More than this, we think we provide an incentive to improve these situations. How do we create these incentives? Let's examine the harms. So we're looking at, in terms of the practical harms, firstly, things like push factors about a lack of opportunity or access to resources, or at least that these are seen to be better in the urban areas. We think that we create incentives in two ways. We create an incentive to government, and we create the incentive for the rich elite within cities to place pressure on government to ensure they improve rural areas. How do we do this? In terms of forcing government action, we'd say that they're not providing at the moment because it's simply not feasible for them to do so when hundreds of people are migrating every day and they're unable to plan effectively in the rural areas how much provision they actually need to do. More than this, though, we say that when government, in a moment now, when government realizes that there are now more people in rural areas, they also have to acknowledge that with more people comes more political power and more ability for those people to hold the government accountable if they're not providing for them. We've seen it with tribes in Brazil where previously they were ignored until they banded together to a number that was great enough for government to actually cater for them. We think that's the kind of power we want to give the people living in the rural areas. Go.
So what would you rather do? Solve the symptoms of a problem or solve the real problem?
We think we solve both. We think that we allow government incentive to improve the rural areas in terms of infrastructure, in terms of farming planning, in terms of providing them with whatever they need to survive in the rural areas. And we think that what this means is that we also solve whatever problem they're speaking about in terms of migration. We do both. Thanks, Botswana. But secondly, what we do is we think we create an incentive for the rich elite to place pressure on government. How is this? It's in two ways, in terms of political pressure and in terms of economic pressure. Firstly, we say that many people in the cities are also harmed by the fact that 410 crimes are reported every single day in Mexico City. We think that those are the kind of things we minimize when we limit rural-urban migration and overpopulation. These people are also powerful enough to put pressure on government to do something about rural areas to ensure that these are the kind of places that people in the urban areas want to move back to. Secondly, in terms of economic pressure, we think that big businesses which go into rural areas, such as the rubber tree industry in Brazil or the bamboo processing industry in Vietnam, create enough capital which goes back into the economy for them to demand infrastructure to be placed in rural areas, to demand that their job is made easier. We think that's the kind of pressure that incentivizes government action. Secondly, though, we think that we allow us to address the second kind of harms, social harms. And when we look at people moving away from the rural areas, we see a breakdown in cultural life, but more than this, we see a breakdown in family structures and things like absentee parents. When you incentivize people to stay within the community that they're living because you've improved the region, we think you also incentivize things like they should look after their children. They should make sure that the community which they have to stay in works. Moreover, when you look at who is leaving, it's the young, active people who have the desire to make something of their lives. We think these are the kind of people we need in the rural areas to ensure some kind of development. More than this, and worse in fact, when these people come back as migrant laborers under the status quo, we think they spread the diseases that Saul spoke about that are created by overpopulation. They spread it to their family, they spread it to their community, and when you look at the fact that 80% of the people in Asia and Africa have tuberculosis, this is simply a problem that we can't ignore. And so, ladies and gentlemen, we understand that this might take time. We understand that the incentives and the pressure have to come from all directions. But we also think that under our policy, we allow for people to actually hold governments accountable, both in the rural and in terms of the people in the city. We think that the bright lights of the city might not be so bright when you compare them to the promise of life in the place that you've lived in your entire life. Thank you.
Greeting to the House. We as the opposition believe that people's rights shouldn't be infringed upon. That is the right for free movement within the country. We believe that the main cause of the problem of people moving from rural areas to cities is that there's underdevelopment in rural areas in the country. So the question here is, what problem are we really solving? The problem here is not the effects of people moving, but the real problem is why people migrate. The reason people migrate within a country is due to uneven distribution of resources and development in the country. As my previous speaker said, the proposition are looking at the runny nose of the matter instead of targeting the germ which causes the flu. The proposition are only blowing their noses, which if the germ is not targeted, the mucus will continue to block their nose. In this matter, the germ represents the lack of development in rural areas. If the government does not target said germ, the mucus will continue to block the nose, which means that the people will continue to run to cities, causing this congestion within the cities themselves. The question is then, why should we distribute the resources amongst everybody? What happens when people have inadequate distribution of resources is people are urged to go where they can get these resources and where the development lies. Because in some of these villages, even running water, tap water is not there. So they have to walk kilometers just to get drinkable water. Whereby in cities, tap water is part of everyday life. What proves that their lives in rural areas, the point that I'd like to ask the proposition is, what proves that their lives in rural areas are actually better than the lives they're living in the city? Though you may say it's dirty, though you may say this and that about it, it could be that in the rural areas it's even worse, because here at least they have access to drinking water. Now, here they have access to such drinking water in close distances, whereby instead of having to walk tens of kilometers each day just to get drinkable water for that day. Also, if we develop villages better, wouldn't people stay because they see developments happening? The problem is that the people have been in the villages for for too long, and they do not see developments happening to urge them to stay, to see where the development takes the village as a village. They do not see opportunities opening up. So if the government could actually set up these developments in cities, the people will see that, no, something is happening. I'm urged to stay because maybe in the near future it would be easier for me to get drinkable water within my house. So basically the opposition are looking at the surface matters and not going deep within the problem to find the problem towards the problem.
Considering the fact that you continue to allow people to leave the rural areas, please tell us what government's incentive to address these areas is.
First of all, if the government can start the development, won't the people in the city see that back home something is happening? Let me go and see what they're doing. Let me go and see if they're improving my home village. Let me go and see if they're improving where I was born. So basically, it's a sort of pull factor to pull the people back to where they originated instead of forcing them back and then forcing developments upon them. So it's basically in consent of the people, so that you are not limiting the rights of the people where they can and cannot go, so that the people can actually have a choice of, do I really want to go back and see what's happening? And if they do, they will go back, and if the development is enough for them to decide to stay, then you have basically achieved your goal of reducing the congestion in cities, reducing the crime, reducing all these surface matters. So, the benefit of, so I have to concede that by limiting these people from entering cities, it would lead to less congestion. But that's looking at the short term, so solution. We're going for a long-term solution that guarantees that there will be less internal migration and also stability of the country.
So,
I'll take one.
So in order for that analysis to work, please will you address my matter about how we give incentives to government to act in these rural areas?
Well, the governments themselves will have to revise their development allocation programs, whereby they have to look at the country as a whole and not specific cities. Yes, so the government actually has to revise its own policies before the people can notice any substantial changes. Also, there is harm in leaving these people in urban areas, as you have stated. The harm is the slums do not develop, since only 5% of them get jobs, so they do not get the required income. But this becomes null and void as soon as their homes develop and they can go back to where there are jobs, where there are things happening, where more of the percentage can get jobs. Also closer to where they originated, closer to their homes. We as opposition believe in equal distribution as resources. We believe that this is the actual solution to the problem. We believe that everyone is entitled to a fair share of the wealth. So by saying this, we're saying everybody in the country deserves development in their settlement. Everybody should get a fair share of the development within the country. It should not only target major cities where international people come, but also looking at the people themselves of that country. Yeah. So also that's I'm not taking more. Also to answer her point of how the government will actually develop these areas, they could set benchmarks for every time a village reaches a certain benchmark in population, they add a development. For example, if a village reaches 200 people, they set up a new school there for the children. If the settlement reaches 5,000 people, they set up a hospital so that the people are well taken care of health-wise. So basically, these benchmarks will set the basis standard for everyone with this amount of people in the country. So we, as the opposition, would like to conclude that the limitations of internal migration within our country is not the actual solution, but would be more effective to go back, revise and update the development allocation program so that everyone in the country is catered for, as this is a long-term guarantee to less congestion in cities, even population distribution within the country, and further stability within the country. Thank you.
Start spreading the news. I'm leaving today. I'm going to be a part of it. Oh, but wait. I'm not moving to New York. I'm moving to the slums of Mumbai, the slums of Lagos. I'm not getting a job. What am I getting? I'm getting the hope of a potentially better life, but with all the associated problems that Botswana have conceded. The fact that I will probably fall prey to drug mules and drug leaders. The fact that I will probably fall prey to tuberculosis in these overly crowded cities. Botswana conceded to all of this, but they deny South Africa and Team South Africa's solution. The fact that we can and we will limit urban migration, and as a result, we can allow for the very solution they want. This idea of provision. This idea that was a fundamental clash in today's debate. I'm going to be doing two things for you today. First, I'm going to be showing why we think that Team South Africa better fulfills Botswana's mandate of ensuring provision, or rather the government's mandate of ensuring provision. And secondly, I'm going to be showing you that we do it through a legitimate mechanism, because they seem to have an ideological problem with us undermining choice. So I'm going lives in slums. They live in shanty towns. This means they don't have access to electricity or running water. Perhaps they only have to walk 2 kilometers instead of 20 to the dam, but that also means that they aren't able to farm or barter in the way that they used to do. They aren't able to have a community structure as they previously did. And on top of that, they fall prey to the exploitation that because of the fact that they're not aware of their rights and are easily exploited in these urban areas. We think that it's because of this that Botswana has misanalyzed the fact that urban areas actually have increased provision. Because for the majority of people, that's not the case at all. So we deny that that's the case. But then, ladies and gentlemen, we also think that we do something to address that. Our model does something to address that because it increases government's ability to plan. Analysis grin ran, that's gone unresponded. We think that at the moment what happens is that government decides to build a hospital. They decide, and their projections show that 50,000 people in the city will use that hospital, or 1 million people will use that hospital. But because of the huge rate of urban-rural migration, ladies and gentlemen, it means that that hospital and those projections are inaccurate. It means government isn't able to build a hospital that can handle the increasing and growing demand. I'll take in a moment, sir. And what does that mean? It means that that resource gets overwhelmed, that they have to add to it piecemeal, and that any possible benefits that come with building something in economies of scale is lost. All of that is lost because they have to constantly add piecemeal. We don't think we allow provision or best provision in urban areas as a result. Yes, sir.
Madam Speaker, are you therefore vouching that trapping people in underdeveloped villages is okay?
Yes, sir. That's exactly what we're saying. We're saying that that's fine. They're underdeveloped now, but we create the incentive for them to develop. And I'm going to show you how we do that. Analysis, my second speaker ran in depth. She told you that at the moment, government doesn't have the incentive to go into these rural areas because there are not as many people there, but also because they're burdened in urban areas. Because so many people are flocking to urban areas, and the limited capacity of developing nations means that they have to focus all their resources here. But that means then, ladies and gentlemen, they aren't able to address the rural areas at all. That doesn't change under Botswana's policy at all. They don't incentivize government to enter urban areas at all. All they told us to this fact was that government was going to review policy. And whilst we think that that's noble, we don't believe that that is grounded in the real world. We don't think that government is actually just able to just stop and look at policy, considering the fact that people are constantly flooding in these urban areas. So what we think is we on Team South Africa incentivize government. We incentivize them to address the rural population, the growing voter base that is now forced to live in rural areas, ladies and gentlemen. They have to pander to that voter base. They have to pander and ensure that they provide some sort of economic development in these areas. We think that it's possible, but we think that only our policy incentivizes this to occur, and that's important. So what we would argue is that we meet their criteria, we solve the problem that they outlined in today, that's equal provision, but it only happens under Team South Africa's model. But then, ladies and gentlemen, why on an ideological level, and I'll take you in a moment, ma'am, can we limit choice? Yes, please. Okay, so when can we limit choice? Well, we told you that choice isn't an absolute right. We think that we can limit choice all the time, and that's why we think our mechanism is legitimate. We think it's because of the fact that there's already a precedent set that we don't allow people to live in industrial zones, for example. Or for the fact that we don't allow an excess of people in a South African taxi because it's dangerous. We think that all of these set a precedent that we limit choice in some sort of way when we know that harms can be accrued. And we told you that there are 3 sorts of things we have to look at. We told you that if we can prove that it's an irrational choice, or that there are harms to the individual, or that there are harms to the society. We showed you we think that this is an irrational choice, and we gave you multiple levels for this. Let me remind you, we think it's an irrational choice because these individuals aren't educated, they lack the knowledge, they lack the awareness of their rights. More than that, they're relying purely on word of mouth. They're relying purely on this idea that people before them have gone and speak back about the glamours of the city because of issues of pride, issues of honor. They don't want to acknowledge that they made a mistake in moving, that they're actually trapped in a shanty town in Lagos rather than living the glamorous life that they try to make it seem that they do. But more than that, ladies and gentlemen, we think that desperation means that people don't weigh up things rationally. We think that's a problem as well. We think that they don't acknowledge the fact that in these areas, provision isn't as great as I've already proven to you. But what does that mean? That means that that choice isn't rational. We think that that means that government can limit that choice. Government can limit rural-urban migration, that freedom of movement of people. We also think that Botswana conceded to the fact that all our harms to individuals and all our harms to society exist. They were just demonstrating against the mechanism we use to solve this. But I've already told you that the mechanism we use works, ladies and gentlemen, which means that considering these harms are accrued, we think we can limit people's ability to move. What we think is that we have a problem with the fact that you honor choice, this lofty ideal of people, only to push them and incentivize them to go into an area where they're not going to have a good quality of life. We have a problem with that on Team South Africa. So what essentially have we as Team South Africa told you? We told you we increase provision. We think we do that legitimately. We think we're the only side of the house that does it in today's debate. But more than that, we told you we have a legitimate mechanism that does it. So yes, I'm starting to spread the news, but certainly I'm not allowing anyone to move today.
Now, I have identified three flashpoints in today's debate. First of all, as per Team South Africa, there's the issue of limiting people's movement versus allowing people to migrate as per Team Botswana. Secondly, there's the issue of irrationality brought about by Team South Africa and the issue of equal distribution of resources as per Team Botswana. And then lastly, the issue that the flashpoint that I've identified is that of harms versus symptoms. Now, the stance of Team Botswana is that we're advocating for equal distribution of resources. Now, I'm going to get onto the rebuttals and then explain the flashpoints that I've just outlined before. Thank you. Now, the third speaker just told us that there is overwhelming use of resources in urban areas. That is just a sign that in the rural areas, people are migrating because they do not have this resources. So they go to the urban areas and exhaust this resources. So I was saying that as Team Botswana, that in order to solve this whole problem of overwhelming use of resources, then we need to deal with the underlying problem. If at all we're going to say, fine, we're going to stop you guys from going to Joburg, if at all that's where you want to go, then what are you giving them as an option of getting what the people in Joburg are getting? Second of all, she talked about how people in rural areas can wait. Now, underscore the fact that time is a very important factor. That says that the people in rural areas have to wait until they reach a certain number in which they can help them now improve the villages and all that. And then that is when they can provide all these resources that they're going to get in urban areas. We're saying that time is a very important factor. And the question that we want to ask Team South Africa is, how long do these people have to wait? They have been waiting for a very long time, which is why now they've taken it into their hands to move into the rural areas. Why they've entered the urban areas? Why? Because they want to get the resources that they're not getting into urban areas. So the question is, how long do they have to keep on waiting? And they also told us that these people will be in urban areas and wait and all that, and then the urban areas that will in rural urban areas rather, they're going to reduce this whole overall use of resources. Now, what we're saying in response to Team Botswana is that by saying that you living in a rural area will give you resources sometime later if your number is the number that we want. You live in an urban area and use this thing. They are eventually marginalizing people, whereby people get resources in urban areas while those in rural areas have to wait. And we're saying that this whole issue of marginalization is something that we do not really want to get to at this point in time. And they also talked about how the people move into the urban areas because of desperation and how this choice is irrational. And our response as Team Botswana is that, our response as Team Botswana is that this irrationality is a symptom of an underlying issue. And again, we're questioning them, do they know the real problem that is involved in this debate? We're saying that in order to solve this whole problem, we need to deal with the underlying issue, which I'm just about to get onto. Now, flash number one down there. They talked about limiting people's movement. And they gave us this model of how they're going to control the number of people in the area where we want to go to. Now here's the little situation. I have just signed a contract of franchising with Spur, and I really want to have this Spur in St. Joburg, and the franchise has told me that it's really good that I have this place, this franchise in Joburg because of the market and all that. And I want to go to develop this whole franchise in Joburg, and they tell me that, you know what, Ms. Mika, we've reached the max point. We can't take you anywhere because of the whole controlling number of people in the area. And when I come and develop this whole franchise, I obviously need labor and all that. So what are they going to tell me? Are they going to deny me the chance to grow as a citizen of the country just because they've reached a max? We're saying that this whole limiting of people is going to deny people the chance to grow. And what is the whole point of having people live in a country where they cannot grow? We're saying that we should, in response to that limiting people's movement, we're saying in response that we should allow these people to move freely. First of all, we need to respect the rights of these people. By placing limits in the first place is telling you, you know what, we have rights, but to some extent, people have the right to movement. And if at all I want to move to Joburg to develop this franchise, then why should you stop me? Second of all, we're saying that these people are moving into these areas. Why? Because they want to surround themselves with opportunities. Imagine, I could have been in Tingujana if at all I wasn't living in the capital city. I wouldn't have the opportunity to be debating right now. Why? Because they take people from the city, and I wouldn't have had the opportunity or the chance to show them my potential. So I think that by going to these urban areas, people are actually surrounding themselves with opportunities that are vital in their lives. And why should you stop people from getting these opportunities? So the conclusion here is, by restricting people's movement, you're denying them the chance to grow. You're denying them the chance to grow, and you're denying them the chance to have free access to all opportunities as other people. And there's really no need to marginalize people. Therefore, the point on limiting people's movement, especially in South Africa, does not stand in this debate. And we believe that then we should give people that freedom to move about and grow as individuals in our country.
So you would allow millions of people to migrate to cities where they don't get their services, and all they really achieve is increase the harms to people in cities already and increase the harms to people they leave behind in rural areas.
I'm going to address that POI on the third touch point of harms versus symptoms. Now, the second touch point that I've identified is the issue of irrationality versus the issue of equal distribution of resources. This Team South Africa has been telling us that these people are moving there because of desperation and all that. They get there, there's this whole time, there's no area, no space for them to live in, they live in the slums of the cities and all that. We're saying that because this is a very clear sign that there is a problem that they're trying to run away from this rural areas. So we're saying that because we've outlined to squat this problem, then we need to solve it. Our question to South Africa is, do you realize what the real problem within this debate is? The real problem is, which brings our second slash point, equal distribution of resources. These people, in the first place, we wouldn't really be having this problem with people migrating if at all there was equal distribution of resources. So I say that instead of going into a very hopeless and somewhat senseless venture of limiting people's movement from rural areas into urban areas, then you might as well have to deal with the underlying factor. Because check this out, if all you're going to limit this movement, fine, we've limited the movement to civil development in South Africa. And then what of those people who are left in the rural areas? How long are they going to have to wait? What of the people left in the rural areas? Don't you also want to give them that chance to develop? So the conclusion in this case is that we need to look more into the equal distribution of resources than to look into the people's irrational behavior and all that. Now the third touch point that we have identified is that of harms versus symptoms. That is where I think people are. They've told us that there are more harms of having these people moving more into the urban areas, issues of crime, congestion, and how these people are going to be unemployed in these areas. Once again, we're saying that we need to deal with the root cause of all the problems. There's no point in wanting to cut a tree, then you just cut off the branches and leave it at that, because eventually the branches will grow. What you need to do is cut the tree right from the roots, then you'll never have to go back to the tree itself. So the whole crime thing and the congestion is just a symptom that, you know what, there's a bigger problem underlying. And the onus of the government is to show us in detail and in a clear model how really they're going to solve this whole problem. Because this whole limited thing will not be solving this issue of crime rate and congestion in these areas. Now the symptoms that we're talking about in response to the touch point is that there's no need in wasting resources, putting people and measures into place into working on the limiting problem. that have to do with issues of people moving or wanting to. So what we've Team Botswana put in this debate, we're basically showing that, first of all, it's not right in the first place to move people, to restrict people's movement because of the incompetence of the government. Secondly, we're saying that the underlying problem which Team South Africa has failed to outline here is that of equal distribution of resources. But we're saying that unless and until you're able to solve this problem, then we can never deal with this whole people migrating. And the fact that we've shown you that whatever the problems that they came up here and identified are just the symptom of the underlying problem.
Now, really, what have we seen today? The stance that Team South Africa has chosen is to say that stop people from going to the cities so that we can have time to think about developing the land. How long have the people in rural villages been voting and waiting? What guarantee is there that by them waiting in the villages, development will come? Because what we see in the status quo is a tendency out of sight, out of mind. Every time that these people have stayed in the villages, they've simply been ignored and starved of development. And that is not something that we want to see. To answer South Africa's side, what we're simply saying as opposition is that, guys, instead of stopping people, because this won't at all help in solving the problem, instead of stopping them from going there, develop those villages first. Let them see you fixing problems and they will go back. If you stop them, if you put up borders, we've seen even with international migration, countries put up stricter laws. Places like Virginia, where if you're seen looking like a migrant, you can simply be checked by the police. Areas like that, they make laws like that, but that doesn't stop people. People get even more incentivized to go because you're simply barring them from it. They want to know what you're hiding. Now, they came with a point of irrationality and how people simply aren't considering the facts. And we're saying they are. People are being rational in the sense that they know that they're being denied, know that there's a better chance to go there, and they're going. In fact, what government should be saying and admitting to and what they are admitting to is the fact that they are inciting the irrational panic within the people. Because people are thinking that there's something wrong clearly with their rural areas and that's why they're not being developed. So what are they doing? They're running to the towers, the beacons, the lights. Though we all acknowledge that there's no guarantee that you'll get anything, there's still that little spark of hope. There's still that light. Because that government, even in a pure way, consider to the fact that it's okay to trap people in these underdeveloped areas, to trap people in ignorance. And that is the whole reason why people are leaving in the first place, lacking knowledge on what the facts are there. So rather than blocking the doors and closing your porch to the people, keeping guards at the roads of Cape Town to prevent rural migrants from coming here, go to the villages, build the schools, build the clinics, better the lives there, and you will see, within a shorter time span, in fact, we believe the side opposition, people will begin going back, repopulating those areas. And South Africa, Botswana, Lagos, or India will become a better country. That is simply what we're saying as side opposition. Now, the issue of incentives, like I've said, outside of the mind, they are trying to take a private sector approach. But what we have to acknowledge is in developing nations, the government is key in everything. They have the money, they have the ability to move. We cannot rely on the private sector side in South Africa to tell government to do anything. Rather, we can push government itself because they have a mandate to the people. The private sector has one role and one role only. It is to make money for themselves and, of course, pay the taxes along the way to help the country. That is where they stop. They are not in any way, you cannot force them to go any further because if you do, they will leave the country. So your idea of incentives actually doesn't work because all you're doing is creating more pull factors to the cities themselves. What is opposition giving you to support developing villages? Right? We've given you the points to show you how scarcity of resources in rural areas is acting as a push factor for these people. And addressing this need is key in solving the problem and not placing limit on how many people can go away or who can go away. That will not work. People have been crossing borders for years now, even though there are rules to prevent them doing so. Biased economic policies. We told you how the urban areas are still getting urban, rural are staying rural. And they expect people to stay in the rural areas in the 21st century. That is not going to be the
due to an incorrect perception that there's provision in the cities, we see people moving into hell on earth in places like Lagos, in places like Mumbai. In reality, what they're doing is dying in slums where government has simply too many people to provide for, and their only source of water comes from the river Styx. What side proposition gave to you today was that we can improve both the urban and the rural areas through our policy. Let's look at how we address the problems of urban areas. We told you things about how only 1 in 5 people gets a job in the urban areas, about how unemployment leads to things like drug abuse, crime, prostitution, and how these kind of harms infringe on the city, infringe on the people living within that city, and are simply too great for government to ignore. Side opposition simply stood up and conceded to them, claiming that they were symptoms of the problem rather than the actual problem. We'd say that government still has an obligation to prevent those symptoms, still has an obligation to address those symptoms, because it hampers our development as a country, it hurts the people themselves. How did we do this? We think we solve the problem by limiting the number of people. What this means that there are fewer people which government has to provide for. We think that we give them the ability to make this decision all the time, to make difficult decisions about the way their people live. Moreover though, and where the main clash in this debate came in, was about rural areas and what we were doing about them. We told you that there are two problems, or at least there were two issues that came up surrounding rural areas. Firstly, provision and how we increase provision, and secondly, whether it's legitimate to limit people's choice to move from these rural areas. In terms of provision, we think government should be uplifting from the bottom up, but we also think that opposition's analysis about a lack of resources is only helped by our policy, where you have a more balanced distribution of population and therefore more balanced ability to distribute resources. Also, we gave you incentives about how we improve these areas. We spoke about more pressure from more people. We spoke about more pressure from the politically and economically powerful in cities. And we told you about how limits ensure that the active people who can minimize the social harms within rural areas remain in those rural areas. We haven't seen any attack on our incentives. We haven't seen any engagement on our incentives. Further than this though, all they did was give us a counter policy which was very similar to what we were proposing without the actual analysis as to how they would allow for government action. We said that essentially it's the status quo, and in a situation where countries are suffering, where 50% of your population is living in the urban areas, it simply shows that the status quo is failing and we need to change it. More than this though, when we look at choice, we'd say that we are able to limit the choices of individuals all the time. But more importantly, if we bring this back to the model which we set up right at the beginning of our case, we told you that people would still be able to move to less densely populated cities if they were able to. We think that this means it isn't such an infringement on choice, but even if it was, they needed to tell us why choice was so important by looking at the analysis we gave you about harms to individuals, harms to the country, the irrationality of the choices that these people are making. They needed to tell us about how they weren't receiving unbiased information, how they were receiving biased information in the rural areas, how there was a lack of education, which all led to an irrational situation that people couldn't live in. In the dying hours of this case, we had some policy sniping from our reply. All we asked them is if China can do it, why can't we? It's as simple as that. Side proposition gives the people a boat to recross the river Styx and escape the fires of hell. Thank you.